Everybody hear me? Yeah. Good. At least it's a bit loud, I think. I also have to take issue with the organizers. First, for putting me in the very last slot at the end of a 3-hour session, maybe 3+ hours, and probably knowing the degree of modulation in my voice. Anyways, I'm going to talk a little bit about, that's not the title, by the way. I'm going to talk a bit about my time working with John. A little bit about work I actually did during my PhD, and I guess some spin-offs of that or pieces of work that embody some related principles, and also a bit about John. So let's see. What do I do? This isn't about me, but I do a lot of things. Some of that is owing to my interaction with John. I met John in 2003, and the way that came about, I actually had very specific ideas for what I wanted to do for my PhD. I don't know why, but for some reason I was drawn to the idea of studying computational attention. And every single person I talked to and asked pointed me to John. And so at some point, I had applied to York, didn't hear anything back. Eventually sent an email to John, even though the website tells you not to contact him. And got a reply. And so I went and I met him, and I was sort of dumbfounded when I left because the welcome was so friendly. I sort of felt like I already known him for a while. He also said to me that he already had over 20 people in his group at the time, and he promised them he wouldn't take anyone else. But he did find some space for me, and I'm very glad he did. So let me move into some more technical stuff for a bit. There's certain things I did during my PhD that still resonate with me, and there's really two things in particular that I want to emphasize. One of them is a bit about dimensionality and structure. I found it sort of funny, there was a mention of John having the biggest numbers in his talks earlier. I think I've got some numbers here that can rival John. I don't know if that's a direct product of having interacted with him, but suppose you're watching TV and this is your favorite channel. And maybe we choose, let's say, a 5x5 window. And we only have a grayscale television. So, but at least we have 8 bits. So how many possible 5x5 windows are there? A lot. There's 256 to the 25, roughly 10 to the 60. We move to 10x10, we're getting to 10 to the 240. If you wanted to see the same 5x5 window, you would have to watch for about 10 to the 44 years. Age of the universe is estimated to be something like 14 billion years. So try all you want. Even if you consider the entire set of 5x5 windows on an 8K display, try watching it your whole life. I dare you. You won't see the same pattern. Prove me wrong. So, suppose I want to somehow quantify how likely a particular pattern in a 5x5 patch is. It seems impossible. if I'm never going to see the same one twice in my entire lifetime, how can I possibly make a decision about anything at all? So, the answer to that, in my view, lies in structure. You're looking at me now. You're not looking at random white noise. You might prefer to be looking at random white noise. But there's a whole lot of structure out there. Structure at sort of a microscopic level, and also general structure. We can take really, abstract things like this, and I think make a lot of sense out of them, because there's so much structure that we have a strong sense of how things are organized. And a lot of this is encoded in how we represent things. So the first thing that's critical in what I'm trying to, I hope some of this resonates with you in whatever area of research you are involved in. Two things, one being, how are things encoded? What is the structure? And the other one, what's relevant? So we've seen a lot of talks about attention. And what is the goal of attention? Well, we'd like to know what's relevant. We could define relevance according to a certain task. It may be that we don't necessarily know what's relevant until we see it. There's lots of definitions for relevance that could be discussed. So I'm going to talk about a few forms of selection, and also a little bit about this idea of structure in data. I think we've been privileged to see some remarkable talks today, and also some, the impact that John's reach has had on everyone in this room is pretty staggering. There's a very simple explanation for that. John is So, some of the things that stuck with me in working with John, first of all, one of these is the deep role of complexity in all of this. People are often quick to point to, well, here's an application here, an application here. No, you'll have some really deep problems. If you want to capture this very general problem and solve it in a very general way, then you need to appeal to these very basic principles. And this provides some strong motivation for attention. But the third part of this is, and I think this is relatively rare, maybe in part, the belief and dedication to a core philosophy. So the stuff that John is presenting, the neurophysiology results we've seen, none of this is based on anything that's new. These are based on ideas that are, 25 years old now, at least. So, how many people do you know in their research have had a certain principle by which you assume things must behave or must be governed, and are able to stick with that and persist in trying to convince the world that it must be so? I can't think of too many people. I think one reason is, well, you publish or perish. Certain things are popular. Sometimes it's easier to publish by jumping on one bandwagon or another. But something that's stuck with me is, choose what your core set of beliefs is, and maybe you do have to stray from that to some extent to at least convince people that the long-term goal you're striving for is worth continuing to support. Anyways, back to what's relevant. So I want to talk about selection mechanisms. This is probably one of the rare cases where maybe more than half of the room has seen this example before. But we've got this thing on the right, something's changing. How many people don't see what's changing? So a bunch of people. And I could say, well, how about if you look underneath the wing? Do you see it? Some people are still squinting. This is off. What if you look right in the center? A cylindrical thing right under the middle of the wing. That's the end. So now you see it. On the right, I could ask you, where's the person? I don't know if there's a person or not. I don't think there's a person there. I could probably look over near the pole or the bushes. You didn't look up in the sky. So again, we have these priors. And we also look around at things. We also have this non-uniform sampling in space as we look around. And we saw some examples where we have this anisotropic distribution of cones, or things are pretty, processing is pretty heavily retina-centered. So what do people look at? So this is going back to work I did during my PhD, except in this case, I didn't yet have the Nicolas Cage image. Everything else is the same. It's always good to include a nice image from the Matrix in your talk if you can. And so we want to solve this problem. We've got something here that's standard. So this is going back to this question of what's the likelihood of a patch. Well, what's the likelihood of a fish here? What's the likelihood of a green fish? It's less than an orange fish. Maybe we can sort of frame this in a more general sense. If I ask you to guess what's behind each of these blacked out regions, you might be able to offer some kind of explanation. Maybe you'd say there's a patch of blue sky, and you'd be right. I think you wouldn't be very close on that one, although some of you would be. So we can frame this in terms of likelihood. We want to know what's the likelihood of that area containing the balloon. Maybe based on the entire image, maybe based on the surround, maybe based on everything we've ever seen before, maybe with a temporal dimension. There's lots of different types of contexts we could assume. But we're still stuck with this problem. How do we escape this problem of dimensionality? Well, we said the world's structured. So what does that mean? Well, suppose you have this data that resides in 3 dimensions, but it actually resides on a 2-dimensional plane. So we really only need 2 axes to completely describe this data. Now, it may not be that the data we're considering is 3 dimensions. It might be 25, it might be 75 if it's an RGB patch, and it might not lie on a plane, it might lie on some kind of manifold. So the first thing we can do is figure out how things are structured. The second favor we might do to ourselves is find a way to coerce the axes that represent this data to be as independent as possible. So the implication of that is you can evaluate this high-dimensional likelihood as a product of one-dimensional likelihoods, if you believe that these things are truly independent. So this was a model that, at the time, 2009, was published in Journal of Vision. And interesting part here, if you've trained a deep neural net lately, it's probably lately because people haven't been doing it for that long, you tend to get something that looks like these features here. This was pre-deep learning, so I'd like to claim that this was the motivation for the work that people did to develop. Obviously, having seen the properties we have here. But it is interesting that what you get, if you try to seek an independent representation of image patches in natural images, are things that are localized edge filters and have color fluency. Things that you see in early visual cortex. At the same time, you have this property that you break these into independent coefficient distributions. So what does the output look like? It looks like this, or if you have a picture like this, which we all do, something like this. So does it work? Yeah, it does. It works pretty well. And it's held up for a long time on a lot of metrics, a lot of different benchmarks. I think one of the reasons is maybe I was naive enough at the time not to push the numbers to the absolute limit I could. And so as new data sets have become available, it's somehow been buoyed by not having been buoyed for a specific data set. So there's the other side of that coin. And this can also explain behavioral phenomena. So there's things like a dead elephant is hard to hide. If you assume an efficient coding perspective, then the predictions you get from this are consistent with a whole lot of different experiments. On coding, these look a bit weird. Right side up, they look even weirder. Again, this comes back to this idea of structure I mentioned. There's an obvious difference in our ability to discriminate or represent faces that are right side up, because these are patterns we're used to. Getting back to this point of foliation, or moving the eye around, active vision. So keep your eyes focused on the center. And what happens here? So I've always found this to be a very interesting case because it suggests that not only is there variability in resolution, but if you consider how things are encoded higher up, it looks like there's some kind of amplification going on. It almost looks as if the more discriminative features are, even at a perceptual level, are more visible. They look like caricatures to me. And maybe you, or maybe I'm the only one who sees it. It sounds like crazy talk. Just an aside, so the model I just showed you, there was a more recent newspaper that shows that this is essentially equivalent or very close to things like graph-based random walks, bilateral filtering, anisotropic diffusion, scale space representations, and really it all comes down to thermodynamics equations. If you're interested, you can look at that paper. So that deals with one form of selection, which is spatial selection. We can jump on the deep learning bandwagon. So let's just take a deep learning model and we'll train it on eye tracking data. So we do that, and that's nice. We get a CVPR paper out of it. It was somebody else's neural architecture, didn't change anything about it. We trained it on eye tracking data. I do think there was more value in that paper though, in that we devoted a great deal of time to describing where it breaks down. So although you see in some of the cases over here on the right, that compared with the ground truth, the deep learning is better. It knows something about what's a face, what's a baby. But at the same time, it ends up doing something closer to template matching. you can provide some examples where there should be very obvious, things that are very obviously salient that just don't pop out. If you have somebody doing a handstand and their face is upside down, guess what? The model doesn't care about that person. So there's something about the ability to generalize that's important. Now, I want to get to selection here. So we've seen some diagrams that look like this already. And we know that neurons up here that encode some higher level concepts have larger receptive fields. And earlier on, we have things that encode simpler features. So to take sort of a fairly generic example, here's a patch from an image that a receptive field sees. Is it a cow or a horse? Horse? Cow? Who says horse? Who says cow? Mostly horse. It's a cow. So suppose we have a larger receptive field that can see a bigger window of the cow. Oh, we know it's a cow now. Well, maybe we should do it again. This thing in the blue box, who thinks it's a horse? Okay, so we do have the information here to discriminate. And we might assume that now that we know that, whatever feature representation is here should maybe somehow be gated if it's providing information that's inconsistent with the higher level interpretation. So we built a neural net that does this in the simplest form. You can think of this as kind of even calling it a poor man's version of selective tuning doesn't do justice to selective tuning. But conceptual inspiration is there. These don't at all do justice to what these actually look like. But maybe you can at least see that things like the lamppost or the people that appear in the ground truth actually appear in the gated version. But in the version with no gating, they're much worse. In fact, we ran this on 4 or 5 different data sets and it gave the best results of using a number of reference models, boosted the performance by 5 to 10% on all of them. All right. So I'll just touch quickly on a couple other things. One of these being frequencies and sensory statistics. So this was a paper around 2006, not far into when I started working with John. I just quickly wrote up a paper that sort of said, here's all the things that you should expect based on how statistics in the visual field are structured. This paper hasn't been cited nearly enough times, so please do cite it. It only has maybe 11 or 12, but there's stuff like Nature Neuroscience, Journal of Neurophysiology, because this was the only thing they could find that explained what they found in their experiments. People have asked me, well, why didn't you do the experiments and get the Nature Neuroscience paper? And I told them, well, it was obvious from the statistics that it'd be true. I wondered why they wasted their time doing the experiment. Emotion and faces, I'm going to skip over this part. The long and short of it is that you can't just subtract 2 faces and expect to get a distance that's meaningful. But if you model the correlation structure, you do get things that align with human judgments. Another case of considering structure, smell-o-vision. So one project I was involved in used these carbon black sensors with organic polymers that change resistance as different vapors run over the surface. And you get something like this from your sensors. You can do supervised training on this if you collect these in sort of a chamber. But if you want to carry this thing around and be able to detect, buttered popcorn and gum on someone's shoe, or fleas, bedbugs maybe. You don't necessarily want to have to collect training data for all of these. So the long and short of this is that going back to this independent component representation that appeared in the AIM model, there's a representation here where the features are normalized so that their L2 norm is 1, and they're also normalized over time, so their L2 norm is 1. And then the objective is simply to create a representation of the data that maximizes sparsity. It ends up behaving like an autoencoder, although there's no explicit built-in loss that forces reconstruction of the input data. Anyways, the nice part is that if you have a small number of vapors that are fairly different, they separate nicely on their own. I think this is the type of thing where attention would play a massive role if you did want buttered popcorn and sticky toffee pudding. So, getting into some conclusions. One, finding useful structure is important. We're really all at a war against dimensionality and complexity. Everyone needs to be involved in this fight. Some people have even called it a curse. I'm not very mystical, but if you subscribe to that, there's apparently some tools. And how is the data structured and how do we select what's relevant? So finally, interesting that this reared its head again. So I think that making a 10 kilogram research career, there's a few things to consider here. Number one is, how many people do you know that have created something like this? I think you'd be hard pressed to find too many things like this online, and even putting that out there for other people to see. I think when I started my PhD, I had a vastly different recipe. It was still about 10 kilograms, but it was terrible. I think luck played a big part for me in meeting with John and becoming a student, because I wouldn't have ended up with this recipe. I might have made something else good. Probably not nearly as good though. But then I realized, looking at this more recently, because I looked at this years ago when I was a trainee and gave a lot of thought to this. And I looked at it in the last few weeks and I thought, well, now that I'm in the position of training students myself, I don't view this the same way. I don't see it as something to be applied to myself. I now see it as something to be applied to others. And I think that that's also something that comes from the interactions that I've had with John, his support, observing the way that he engages with others, his enthusiasm, and just unending support. I wouldn't be standing up here today if it weren't for John. And, well, that's obvious since it's about him. But at the same time, this isn't necessarily a recipe for a 10 kilogram research career. It's for a 10 kilogram Jedi. So thank you, John.